The bright morning sun streamed through the windows of Elite Styles, catching the dust particles floating in the air. Jasmine stood across the street, coffee in hand, watching customers enter and exit the boutique she now owned. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself for another day of keeping her true identity hidden. 2 weeks ago, Jasmine had signed the final papers to purchase this struggling clothing store in the upscale Westlake shopping district. At 35, she had worked her way up from a retail assistant to owning her own business, powered by determination and an MBA she'd earned while working full-time. The boutique would be her biggest venture yet. Just observe for now, her business mentor had advised. See how things run before making changes. So instead of announcing herself as the new owner, Jasmine had introduced herself as a consultant hired to help improve the store's performance. The current manager, Richard Keller, had been kept on temporarily during the transition. He was a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a habit of looking down his nose at people. Jasmine had noticed immediately how differently he treated customers, warm and attentive to wealthy-looking white shoppers, dismissive toward everyone else. Jasmine crossed the street and pushed open the heavy glass door. A small bell announced her arrival, but no one greeted her. The store was beautiful, marble floors, elegant lighting, quality merchandise, but something about the atmosphere felt cold. "You're late," Richard's voice came from behind a display of designer handbags. He didn't look up from the tablet in his hands. "Training starts at 9, not 9:15. "Sorry about that," Jasmine replied, keeping her voice level despite the unnecessary criticism. Traffic was backed up on Main Street. Richard finally looked up, his eyes traveling from her sensible flats to her simple blouse. The slight curl of his lip told her everything about what he thought of her appearance. "Well, we have standards here. Punctuality is one of them." He turned away, dismissing her. "Check the stockroom. Shipment came in yesterday, and nobody's had time to unpack it." Jasmine nodded and headed toward the back, passing a young white sales associate who was scrolling through her phone despite 3 customers browsing nearby. Richard said nothing to her about customer service. The stockroom was a mess, boxes stacked haphazardly, inventory forms unfiled, merchandise returns piled in a corner. No wonder the store was failing. Jasmine rolled up her sleeves and got to work, making mental notes of everything she observed. Throughout the morning, she watched Richard's interactions with staff and customers. His tone changed completely depending on who he was addressing. When a group of wealthy-looking white women entered, he practically sprinted across the floor to assist them. When an older black woman asked about a display item's price, he directed her to a clearance rack she hadn't even asked about. During lunch break, Jasmine sat alone, reviewing notes on her phone. The sales numbers were abysmal for such a prime location. Employee turnover was high. 12 different sales associates in the past year alone. Customer complaints mentioned unfriendly service and uncomfortable shopping experience. "Planning to fix this place up by you?" asked Trisha, a middle-aged sales associate who plopped down beside her. She had kind eyes and seemed genuinely interested. "Just making observations for now," Jasmine replied carefully. "Well, observe away, honey. This place needs fixing." Trisha leaned closer. "Between you and me, the biggest problem is sitting in that office." Jasmine followed Trisha's gaze toward Richard's office door, which was firmly shut. "That bad?" "Worse than you know." Last month, he followed a black teenage girl around the store until she left in tears. Claimed she looked suspicious. She was a judge's daughter shopping for a prom dress. Jasmine's stomach tightened. This was worse than she imagined. She bought the store for its potential and location, knowing it needed operational improvements. She hadn't realized she'd be dealing with this level of toxicity. "Things will change," Jasmine said quietly, more to herself than to Trisha, "sooner than anyone expects." Little did she know how soon that change would come, or how dramatically it would unfold. Saturday morning brought a rush of weekend shoppers to Elite Styles. The store hummed with activity as customers browsed through racks of clothing and accessories. Jasmine had arrived early, dressed in comfortable jeans and a simple navy t-shirt, practical clothes for the inventory work she planned to do in the stockroom. She slipped in through the back entrance, nodding hello to the delivery man dropping off packages. The stockroom was even more chaotic than usual, with boxes stacked in precarious towers and merchandise scattered across every surface. Jasmine tied her curly hair back and got to work, sorting items by department and checking them against the inventory list. After about an hour, she stepped out to grab a clipboard from the office she'd soon claim as her own. The store was packed now, with at least 20 customers browsing the displays. Richard stood near the front, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and artificially brightening his voice as he spoke to a group of well-dressed white women. "This just came in from our Paris supplier," he was saying, showing them an overpriced scarf that Jasmine knew had actually been manufactured in New Jersey. "Very exclusive." Jasmine shook her head slightly and continued toward the office. She needed to check the weekend delivery schedule. "Hey, you!" Richard's sharp voice cut through the store's ambient music. Jasmine turned, realizing he was addressing her. His face had transformed. Gone was the smooth salesman's smile, replaced by a hard, suspicious glare. "What do you think you're doing back there?" he demanded, loud enough that nearby customers turned to look. He strode toward her with stiff shoulders and clenched fists. "I'm just checking the delivery schedule," Jasmine explained calmly, though her heart had begun to race. "For the inventory count." "In my office? Without permission?" Richard's voice grew louder. "I've been watching you sneaking around all morning." A small crowd of customers had started to gather, watching the confrontation with uncomfortable expressions. Tricia stepped forward from where she'd been helping a customer, concern written across her face. "Richard, she's the consultant the company sent," Tricia began, but Richard cut her off with a sharp wave. "I know exactly what she is," he snapped, eyes never leaving Jasmine. "Someone who doesn't belong in this store." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. A few customers exchanged troubled glances. "I have every right to be here," Jasmine said firmly, keeping her voice steady despite the humiliation burning through her. "If you check with corporate." "I don't need to check anything," Richard interrupted. "I've been managing this store for 8 years. I know when someone doesn't belong." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "First, I catch you in the stockroom without supervision. Now you're trying to access private office files. What were you planning to steal today?" Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Jasmine felt her cheeks grow hot with anger and embarrassment. "I'm not stealing anything," she said, keeping her voice measured while meeting his gaze directly. "I'm doing my job." "Your job?" Richard scoffed, looking her up and down with undisguised contempt. "Dressed like that? In those shoes? I don't think so." A middle-aged woman with grocery bags stepped forward. "Excuse me, but is this really necessary? She doesn't seem to be doing anything wrong." Richard turned to the woman with a practiced customer service smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a security matter. We've had problems with theft." He turned back to Jasmine, the smile vanishing. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately. And empty your pockets first." "I will not," Jasmine replied, her patience wearing thin. "I have authorization to be here." "Show me," Richard demanded, holding out his hand. "Show me your authorization right now." Jasmine reached for her purse, which she'd left in the stockroom. "My ID and paperwork are in my bag. Let me get them." "Oh no," Richard said, stepping to block her path. "You're not going anywhere else in this store unattended. Thomas." He called to the security guard who stood near the entrance. "Keep an eye on her. I'm calling the police." The word police sent a chill through Jasmine. This was spiraling out of control faster than she could have imagined. "You're making a serious mistake," she warned him quietly. Richard pulled out his cell phone, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "No, I think you're the one who made the mistake today." Richard held his phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Jasmine as he spoke to the 911 dispatcher. "Yes, I need police at Elite Styles in Westlake Shopping Center. I have a trespasser who's refusing to leave." He paused, listening. "No, not violent yet, but she's attempting to access restricted areas of the store. I believe she was planning to steal merchandise." The unfairness of his words made Jasmine's chest tighten. She looked around at the customers watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and a few were already pulling out their phones, aiming camera lenses in her direction. "This is ridiculous," Jasmine said, taking a deep breath to stay calm. I just need to get my purse from the back room. My ID and authorization papers are in there. Richard covered his phone with his hand. You're not going anywhere until the police arrive. Thomas, don't let her out of your sight. The security guard shifted awkwardly. He was young, maybe early 20s, and looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation. Sir, maybe we should just let her get her ID. Are you questioning me? Richard snapped. I'm the manager here. She could have accomplices waiting in the back for all we know. Jasmine almost laughed at the absurdity of his claim. Accomplices? For what? A heist at a clothing store in broad daylight with 20 witnesses. A few customers chuckled nervously. One woman with a shopping bag stepped forward. I've been shopping here for years, and I've never seen anything like this. She's just standing there, for goodness sake. Ma'am, please stay back, Richard said, his customer service voice slipping back on like a mask. This is a security matter. Trisha approached again, this time more boldly. Richard, I really think you're making a mistake. Corporate sent her here to help with. Did I ask for your opinion? Richard cut her off sharply. Get back to work, or you can join her. Jasmine watched Trisha's face fall as she backed away. This was the true Richard Keller, the man who had run this beautiful store into the ground with his toxic management style. Look, Jasmine said, trying once more. Let's handle this professionally. Call the district manager if you don't believe me. The district manager reports to me. Richard lied smoothly. Jasmine knew this wasn't true. The store's organizational chart had been part of the purchase paperwork. That's not accurate, she replied. And you know it. Richard's face flushed with anger. How dare you accuse me of lying in my own store? It's not your store, Jasmine said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. The statement hung in the air. Richard's eyes narrowed dangerously. What did you just say to me? He hissed, stepping closer. Before Jasmine could respond, the store's front door opened and 2 police officers walked in. One was a tall white man with a serious expression, the other a shorter Hispanic woman who scanned the room quickly, assessing the situation. Richard immediately hurried over to them. Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. This woman, he pointed directly at Jasmine, has been caught in restricted areas of the store. When confronted, she refused to leave the premises. The male officer approached Jasmine while his partner stayed with Richard, taking notes. Ma'am, can I see some identification, please? The officer asked, his hand resting near his belt. My ID is in my purse in the back room, Jasmine explained. This man won't allow me to retrieve it. She could be hiding stolen merchandise back there, Richard interjected, or destroying evidence. The female officer looked at him skeptically. Evidence of what, sir? Richard faltered for a moment. Well, unauthorized access to private business records. Corporate espionage, possibly. Several customers were openly recording now. A teenage girl whispered loudly to her mother, "This is going on TikTok for sure." Officer, Jasmine said calmly, I'm not a thief or a spy. I'm here in an official capacity. If you would just escort me to the stockroom so I can get my identification. Nice try, Richard interrupted. Officers, I want her removed from the premises immediately and charged with trespassing. And I want the stockroom searched for stolen items. The male officer turned to Jasmine. Ma'am, at this point, I need to ask you to come with me outside while we sort this out. Am I being detained? Jasmine asked, her heart pounding. For now, yes, the officer replied. Until we can verify your identity and determine what's going on here. Trisha stepped forward again, wringing her hands. Officers, please, there's been a misunderstanding. She's supposed to be here. Stay out of this, Richard snapped at her. The female officer raised an eyebrow at Richard's tone. Sir, we'd like to hear from your employee as well. She doesn't know anything, Richard insisted. She just started last month. As the officers conversed quietly, Jasmine could see the situation sliding further out of control. In just minutes, her plan to quietly observe the store had turned into a public spectacle. And worse, she was about to be escorted out of her own business in handcuffs. Officer, she said firmly, I need to make a phone call. Right now. Who are you calling? Richard demanded. Jasmine met his gaze steadily. My lawyer. Richard's face darkened at Jasmine's mention of a lawyer. You won't need a lawyer if you just leave peacefully, he said, his voice dripping with fake concern. Unless you have something to hide. The male officer stepped between them. Sir, please step back and let us handle this. He turned to Jasmine. Ma'am, you can call your lawyer, but first I need to know if you have any identification on you right now. As I've been trying to explain, Jasmine said, struggling to keep her voice steady, my purse with my ID is in the back room. This man won't let me get it. The female officer nodded. I'll go with you to retrieve your purse. Absolutely not, Richard cut in. For all we know, she has stolen merchandise back there, or an accomplice. The female officer gave Richard a long look. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to step back and let us do our job. Richard's nostrils flared, but he took a reluctant step backward. The crowd of customers had grown larger, with nearly everyone in the store now watching. Several had their phones raised, recording everything. An older black woman in the crowd spoke up. This is disgraceful. You can see what's happening here. Ma'am, please stay back, the male officer said without looking at her. The female officer motioned for Jasmine to lead the way to the stockroom. Just as they started walking, Richard stepped forward again. Officer, I insist that I accompany you. As the manager, I'm responsible for all merchandise and property in this store. The female officer looked like she wanted to object, but finally nodded. Fine, but stay behind us. The three made their way through the store, past racks of expensive clothing and displays of accessories. Jasmine could feel everyone's eyes on her back, hear the whispers spreading. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. In the stockroom, Jasmine pointed to her purse on a shelf near the inventory clipboard. That's my bag right there. Don't touch anything else, Richard warned as the officer retrieved the purse and handed it to Jasmine. Jasmine opened her bag and pulled out her wallet. With slightly trembling fingers, she removed her driver's license and handed it to the officer. Jasmine Williams, the officer read aloud, checking the photo against Jasmine's face. Now, about your claim to be here officially, the officer continued. Do you have any documentation for that? Jasmine reached deeper into her bag and pulled out a leather portfolio. My business cards and authorization papers are in here. Before she could open it, Richard suddenly lunged forward and snatched the portfolio from her hands. What do you think you're doing? Jasmine demanded, shocked by his boldness. Checking for stolen property, Richard said, flipping the portfolio open. His eyes scanned the first document, and for a brief moment, his expression faltered. The female officer stepped forward. Sir, hand that back to me now. Richard quickly composed himself and passed the portfolio to the officer, not to Jasmine. Those papers could be forged. Anyone can print fake documents these days. The officer examined the papers, flipping through several pages while Jasmine and Richard stood in tense silence. Finally, she looked up at Jasmine with an unreadable expression. Ms. Williams, I still need to verify these credentials. Let's go back out front while I make a call. They returned to the main floor of the store, where the crowd had grown even larger. The male officer was asking people to step back, but few were listening. The tension in the air was palpable. My partner will verify your documentation, the male officer told Jasmine. In the meantime, I need you to put your hands behind your back. What? Jasmine couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're arresting me. For what? It's just a precaution until we sort this out, he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced himself. Richard stood nearby, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Officers, I want to press charges for trespassing and attempted theft. You haven't even found anything stolen, Tricia protested from behind the counter. The male officer ignored both comments and reached for his handcuffs. Ma'am, please turn around. Jasmine felt a wave of anger and injustice wash over her. This was her store. She had the papers to prove it, yet here she was, about to be handcuffed like a criminal. This is wrong, and you know it, she said quietly to the officer. Nevertheless, she turned around slowly. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. A collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Someone called out, "This is messed up." "I'm calling the news," another voice said. The female officer was on her radio, walking a few steps away as she spoke in hushed tones. Jasmine stood tall despite the handcuffs, refusing to show how deeply humiliated she felt. Richard addressed the crowd with his hands raised placatingly. "Folks, everything is under control. The police are just doing their job. The store will remain open for your shopping convenience." "Are you kidding me right now?" A customer shot back. "You think anyone wants to shop here after seeing this?" As the male officer took Jasmine's arm to lead her toward the door, the store's front entrance suddenly swung open. A tall man in an expensive suit walked in, briefcase in hand, looking around in confusion at the scene before him. "What in the world is going on here?" he demanded, his eyes widening as they landed on Jasmine in handcuffs. The well-dressed man who had just entered the store looked from Jasmine in handcuffs to the officers and then to Richard with growing disbelief. His presence commanded immediate attention. Even the murmuring crowd quieted down. "Anthony," Jasmine said with visible relief. "Thank goodness you're here." Anthony Chen was Jasmine's attorney, and they had scheduled a meeting for that afternoon to discuss renovation contracts for the store. He placed his briefcase on a nearby counter and straightened his tie, his expression shifting from confusion to controlled anger. "Officers," he said calmly but firmly, "I'm Anthony Chen, Ms. Williams' attorney. May I ask why my client is in handcuffs?" The male officer hesitated. "Sir, this is an ongoing situation. The manager has reported this woman for trespassing and potential theft." Richard stepped forward, clearly irritated by the lawyer's arrival. This woman was caught in restricted areas of the store and refused to leave when asked. "She claims to be here on official business, but has provided suspicious documentation." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious documentation?" The female officer, who had been checking her phone, looked uncomfortable. "We're still verifying her credentials, sir." "Allow me to verify them for you," Anthony said, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a folder and removed several official-looking documents. "These are the property transfer papers for Elite Styles Boutique, transferred to the sole ownership of Jasmine Williams as of 2 weeks ago." He handed the papers to the female officer. "You'll find everything is in order, properly notarized and filed with the county clerk's office." The store fell completely silent. Every eye turned to Richard, whose face had gone from red to ashen white. What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling. "That's impossible. The owner is a corporation based in New York." "Was a corporation based in New York," Anthony corrected. "The business was purchased by Ms. Williams' company, Phoenix Retail Group, 2 weeks ago. The sale was finalized last Monday." He pulled out another document. "Here's a copy of the memo that was sent to all store management, including you, Mr. Keller. Did you not receive it?" Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The female officer was examining the documents carefully while her partner shifted uncomfortably, his hand still on Jasmine's arm. "Officer," Anthony said pointedly, looking at the handcuffs, "my client cannot be trespassing in a building she legally owns. I suggest you remove those immediately." The male officer looked to his partner, who nodded after reviewing the papers. With visible embarrassment, he took out his keys and removed the handcuffs from Jasmine's wrists. Jasmine rubbed her wrists, her dignity intact despite the ordeal. The watching crowd had begun to whisper excitedly, and several people were still recording everything on their phones. "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice suddenly small. "Nobody told me the store had been sold." Anthony gave him a cool look. "As I just mentioned, a memo was sent to all management. Perhaps you should check your email more carefully, Mr. Keller." Tricia stepped forward, unable to contain herself any longer. "He knew. I saw him reading an email about new ownership last week. He told everyone it was just a routine corporate restructuring." Richard shot her a venomous look. "That's a lie. I never—" "Mr. Keller," Jasmine interrupted, her voice calm but carrying throughout the store. "As the owner of Elite Styles, I've been observing the store operations for the past 2 weeks. I chose not to announce my position immediately because I wanted to see how the business was running without interference." She looked around at the crowd of customers, many of whom were now smiling in satisfaction at the turn of events. "What I've seen today is disappointing, to say the least." Richard's face had turned an unhealthy shade of gray. "Ms. Williams, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Jasmine cut him off. You called the police on me because of how I look. You assumed I was a thief because I'm black. You treated me with disrespect from the moment I walked in the door, just as I've seen you treat other people of color who enter this store. The female officer closed her notepad. Ms. Williams, on behalf of the department, I apologize for this situation. If you'd like to file a complaint about how this was handled. That won't be necessary, officer, Jasmine replied. You were doing your job based on the information provided to you. The person who should be apologizing is Mr. Keller. All eyes turned to Richard, who had backed up against a display case, looking trapped. The customers were watching him with open disdain now. I didn't know, he stammered. How was I supposed to know you were the owner? You weren't, Jasmine said simply. But you shouldn't treat anyone the way you treated me today, regardless of who they are or what position they hold. Anthony placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. Would you like me to ask everyone to leave so we can discuss next steps privately? Jasmine shook her head. No need. She turned to address the entire store. Everyone, I apologize for the disruption to your shopping experience today. As the new owner of Elite Styles, I want to assure you that what you witnessed here does not reflect the values of this business moving forward. A smattering of applause broke out among the customers. Richard looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape route. You can't do this, he said, his voice cracking. I've managed this store for 8 years. Jasmine met his gaze steadily. And that ends today, Mr. Keller. You're fired. The words "you're fired" hung in the air like a thunderclap. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. Then Richard's face contorted with a mixture of shock, rage, and humiliation. You can't just, this isn't, he sputtered, looking around as if seeking support from the crowd of onlookers. But all he found were hostile or pitying glances. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, Jasmine continued calmly. Your final paycheck will be processed according to state law. Thomas, the young security guard who had been awkwardly watching the whole scene unfold, stepped forward hesitantly. Should I? Yes, please escort Mr. Keller to his office and then to the exit, Jasmine confirmed with a nod. Richard's shock was quickly morphing into desperation. This is completely unprofessional. You can't judge my entire career based on one misunderstanding. Tricia let out a short, disbelieving laugh. One misunderstanding? You've been treating people like this for years. Several other employees who had gathered around nodded in agreement. Ms. Williams, Richard tried again, his voice taking on a pleading tone. Let's discuss this privately. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. Jasmine shook her head firmly. There's nothing to discuss. Your actions today were the final confirmation of what I've observed over the past 2 weeks. This store will be moving in a different direction. As Thomas led a shell-shocked Richard toward his office, the customers began to disperse, many of them stopping to introduce themselves to Jasmine and express their support. The 2 police officers approached her next. Ma'am, we apologize for the misunderstanding, the female officer said, looking genuinely contrite. If you'd like to file a formal complaint about the false report. Thank you, officer, but that won't be necessary, Jasmine replied, still rubbing her wrists where the handcuffs had been. I'd rather focus on moving forward. After the officers left, Anthony placed a supportive hand on Jasmine's shoulder. You handled that remarkably well. Are you okay? Jasmine took a deep breath. I will be. It's not exactly how I planned to announce my ownership, but maybe it's better this way. No more hiding. By closing time, the story of what had happened at Elite Styles had already begun spreading throughout the shopping district. Employees from neighboring stores stopped by to introduce themselves to Jasmine, and several regular customers made a point of coming in to show their support. The next morning, Jasmine arrived early to find local news vans parked outside the store. A reporter approached her as she unlocked the front door. Ms. Williams? I'm Lisa Patel from Channel 7 News. We've received several videos of yesterday's incident at your store. Would you be willing to comment? Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. Briefly, yes. The interview was short but powerful. Jasmine spoke calmly about what had happened, emphasizing that the incident reflected a larger problem in retail environments, where customers and employees of color often faced unfair treatment. My goal moving forward is to create a welcoming space for everyone, she told the camera. What happened yesterday was unfortunate, but it gives us an opportunity to have important conversations about bias and discrimination in everyday settings. By that evening, the story had gone viral. Clips of Richard calling the police, Jasmine in handcuffs, and the dramatic revelation of her ownership were playing on news stations and social media platforms across the country. Hashtag #LitStyle Stakedown and hashtag #OwnTheStore became trending hashtags. The next day, Jasmine's phone rang constantly with calls from other news outlets, business publications, and even a few local politicians wanting to show their support. She declined most interview requests, preferring to focus on reorganizing the store. Trisha, who had been promoted to assistant manager, stuck her head into Jasmine's new office around lunchtime. "You might want to see this," she said, holding up her phone. It was a local business news site featuring a statement from Richard Keller claiming he had been set up and was considering legal action for wrongful termination. There was also a growing comment section beneath the article, with dozens of people sharing their own negative experiences with Richard during his time at Elite Styles. "Should we be worried?" Trisha asked. Jasmine shook her head. "He doesn't have a case. We have documentation of his behavior, witness statements, and now all these comments. But more importantly, we have video evidence of him racially profiling and falsely accusing the store's owner." Later that afternoon, the district police captain arrived at the store asking to speak with Jasmine privately. "Ms. Williams, I want to personally apologize for how the situation was handled by our officers," he said once they were seated in her office. "We've reviewed the bodycam footage and believe additional training is needed. I'd like to invite you to participate in our community advisory panel on police community relations." Jasmine thanked him for the apology. "I'll consider your invitation. Right now, my focus is on rebuilding this store and its reputation." As the captain left, Jasmine looked around at the office, her office. The walls were still bare, and Richard's pretentious decorations had been removed, leaving behind only the essentials. A blank canvas just waiting for her vision to transform it. Outside, she could hear the buzz of customers in the store, more than they'd had in weeks, according to Trisha. People were curious about the store that had been all over the news. Her phone chimed with a notification. Another news outlet had picked up the story, this time with a headline that made her smile. "From handcuffs to handlebar. Woman arrested in her own store becomes face of retail discrimination awareness." It wasn't how she planned to launch her new business, but perhaps it was exactly the shake-up the store needed. 6 months had passed since the day Jasmine was handcuffed in her own store. The memory still brought a twinge of discomfort, but when she looked around Elite Styles now, she couldn't help but smile at how much had changed. The store itself had undergone a complete transformation. Gone were the stuffy displays and uninviting atmosphere that Richard had cultivated. The walls were now painted in warm, welcoming colors, with comfortable seating areas scattered throughout. Large windows let in natural light, and the layout had been redesigned to be more spacious and accessible. But the physical changes were just the beginning. The real transformation was in the store's culture and the people who worked there. "Morning, boss," called out Trisha, who had flourished in her role as assistant manager. "The new summer collection just arrived. Want to check it out?" "Absolutely," Jasmine replied, following her to the stockroom. The stockroom, once a chaotic mess, was now meticulously organized. 2 employees were efficiently unpacking boxes and checking items against inventory lists. "Leigh and David, the display looks amazing," Jasmine complimented as she passed. "The way you arranged those accessories is really eye-catching." The young employees beamed at the praise. Jasmine had made a point of learning everyone's names and recognizing their contributions. It was one of many changes she'd implemented to create the kind of workplace she'd always wanted to be part of. After reviewing the new merchandise, Jasmine returned to the main floor just as the doors opened for business. A steady stream of customers began flowing in. A typical morning now, but a dramatic change from the struggling store she'd purchased. "Ms. Williams," a woman approached with a smile. "I just wanted to thank you for your help last week. My daughter wore the dress to her interview and got the job." "That's wonderful news," Jasmine replied warmly. "Please tell her congratulations from all of us." These personal connections had become the hallmark of Elite Styles. Under Richard's management, the store had catered exclusively to wealthy white customers. Now it welcomed everyone, with inventory that reflected diverse tastes, sizes, and price points. Around noon, Jasmine welcomed a group of business students from the local community college. She had started offering monthly workshops on retail management and entrepreneurship using her own experiences, including the infamous arrest incident, as teaching moments. "The most important thing I've learned," she told the attentive students, "is that your business reflects your values. Every policy, every hiring decision, every interaction with a customer is a chance to show what matters to you." After the workshop, Jasmine checked her calendar and smiled. Today marked exactly 6 months since the incident, as her staff now jokingly called it. It seemed fitting that she had another important meeting scheduled. At 2 o'clock, Anthony arrived with paperwork in hand. "Everything's finalized," he announced as they settled in her office. The discrimination lawsuit against Richard was settled out of court. He agreed to attend sensitivity training and perform community service. Jasmine nodded satisfied. She hadn't wanted money from the lawsuit, just accountability and the chance for Richard to learn from his mistakes. "And what about the other matter?" she asked. Anthony smiled. "The lease is signed. Elite Styles 2 can begin renovations next month. Your expansion plan is officially underway." Jasmine felt a surge of pride. The success of her first store had happened faster than she'd ever imagined, allowing her to move forward with her vision of opening a chain of inclusive boutiques. "We've come a long way in 6 months," she said, glancing at the framed newspaper article on her wall, the one with the picture of her in handcuffs that had gone viral nationwide. Later that afternoon, Jasmine gathered all the employees for their weekly meeting. Along with updates on sales numbers and upcoming promotions, she had a special announcement. "As you know, today marks 6 months since I was arrested in this very store," she began, looking around at the supportive faces of her team. "What could have been the worst day of my professional life became the catalyst for something extraordinary." She pulled a cover off a large board to reveal their latest sales figures, the highest in the store's 15-year history. "But the numbers are just one measure of success," she continued. "I'm more proud of the community we've built here. The way you treat each customer with respect, regardless of how they look or what they can afford to buy. The way you support each other. The way we've turned this store into a place where everyone feels welcome." The team applauded, and several employees shared their own reflections on how the store had changed their lives. Lai spoke about finding his first job where he wasn't judged for his accent. David mentioned how working at Elite Styles had helped him pay for college. Trisha wiped away tears as she talked about finally feeling valued after decades in retail. As the meeting concluded, a delivery person arrived with a large arrangement of flowers. Jasmine opened the card, surprised. To Ms. Williams, she read aloud, "Your grace and determination have taught me valuable lessons about prejudice and redemption. I am a better person because of you. With sincere apologies and admiration, Richard Keller." A hush fell over the room. Then Trisha spoke up, "Well, would you look at that? Maybe people really can change." Jasmine smiled, placing the card back among the flowers. "That's what I believe. That's why we're here." As the store closed that evening, Jasmine stood outside for a moment, looking at the illuminated Elite Style sign. She remembered standing in this same spot 6 months ago, nervous about her new venture, never imagining the journey that lay ahead. The handcuffs had left no physical marks on her wrists, but they had left an indelible mark on her spirit, not a wound, but a reminder of her strength and purpose. What Richard and those officers hadn't understood that day was that they weren't dealing with just any woman. They were dealing with someone who knew her worth and refused to be diminished by others' assumptions. She turned the key in the lock, listening to the satisfying click. Her store, her vision, her triumph.